Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Wednesday. I'm Gary Adcock here for the Zacuto Live podcast. In the studio with me, I've got Megan Donnelly, training manager from AbelCine Chicago. And online on Skype, we've got Matt Duclos from Duclos Lenses. And then coming in the studio, we've got Rachel following up to make sure that all your questions are answered and keeps us kind of in line here for the show. So Megan, introduce yourself, talk a little bit, give us a little bit of it. And
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hi, Matt and Rachel and everybody online. I'm Megan Donnelly. I am the training manager with AbelCine Chicago office. And I'm also a director of photography, so I freelance as well, primarily in commercials, but I do plenty of narratives and music videos as well, where I get to have a little more fun and flair and a little more style. So I always talk about myself as half creative and half technical, and I try to figure out what's the hybrid there of keeping all of it current and also testing new things, trying new things out. So happy to be here talking about new technology.
Matt, give us a 411 on you.
But really just sort of a project manager, all things lens related. It's what I've always done. It's what I'll probably always do. Anything lens related.
Awesome.
Rachel, you gonna chime in there?
Yeah, hi everybody. It looks like some of you are joining us here on Facebook already, which is wonderful. So if you have any questions as the show goes on or anything you want to talk about what you saw at IBC, just put a comment in the chat and I will make sure that we talk about it. Have fun.
Well, IBC, big European show. A lot of people in America don't go to it, don't know a lot about it. And it's interesting because I've always found IBC to be one of the bigger trade shows. Mm-hmm. It's interesting the kind of things that go on. And this year it was followed by a German camera show called Scenic. And then immediately after that, Photokina.
Right.
So we've got this massive amount of information coming in, much of it camera related. But let's kick off with some of the first stuff. I got to go through some of the things that popped up at IBC, and I'm going to start with Blackmagic RAW because it's kind of interesting. If you pop up the first graphic for me, Sean, one of the things that's interesting about this is that Blackmagic RAW is composed of a bunch. And when you think about the base bandwidth of a 4.6K codec, you're looking at 550 megabytes a second. Go to the next one, Sean. And then what Blackmagic RAW has done is offer us two levels of compression. So they're giving us constant bitrate conversion, where we're doing 3:1, 5:1, 8:1, 12:1 compression ratios. And then they're giving us a constant quality,
right,
which is a very specific bitrate design, variable bitrate designed to maintain a very, very high image quality in that same codec level. And what you start looking at is that you start getting these compression levels that are very, very small.
Right.
And that brings up something, put up the third graphic on this if you would, Sean, that just shows it all together. When you're talking about that 550 megabyte, it's kind of the limit of, that's 10 gig Ethernet, but it's also the limit of most of the camera media. Right. When you think about that as a recording format and what that speed level is. And to start getting it in, you start talking about 12:1 ratio in the constant bitrate recording. We're talking about, ProRes LT levels of compression with higher quality.
Right.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, it's Firewire at that point. So we have that kind of, and then the constant bitrate compression. So I haven't tested any of these yet, so I haven't had a chance to see it. But being able to choose between a consistent amount of compression or a consistent quality setting is a real interesting way to go.
Yeah.
But the ProRes RAW thing is where we start getting this because, Blackmagic RAW is only available in the Ursa Mini right now. Right. And while Blackmagic left an SDK on it, we started seeing some of the other things that are involved with it. It's like, ProRes RAW available in more cameras, more devices, but only available in Final Cut Pro, which limits the use on it. Whereas Blackmagic RAW, available in Resolve, much wider usage base, but a smaller number of cameras.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting in that we get to see that. Comment?
I was just going to add one thing that I think it's interesting watching those develop because it's the idea of keeping as much of the sensor quality as we can without the high file format of RAW. So opening up maybe more independent workflows that they can still shoot RAW as opposed to having to shoot compressed.
Well, and I think that brings up a real interesting point. I mean, let's be honest, if it hadn't have been for ARRI, we would have never seen ProRes as widely accepted in the film community as it is.
Right.
And that kind of changed everyone's workflow. and to have the ProRes RAW only in Final Cut and limited, but on a wider number of devices, it's an interesting kind of dichotomy in how they're going to do it.
Right.
I think that the one thing that I know, having read the specs on the two codecs, is the ProRes RAW has a deeper container available. Because it's my understanding that ProRes RAW can support up to 16 bits, whereas it looks like the Blackmagic RAW is designed around a 12-bit based transform. I think it does some things in half float, 16-bit, but I think most of it's designed around 12-bit.
Okay, yeah.
So that'll be an interesting thing.
Right. We'll have to watch how it develops with the different workflows available.
And that's going to be the interesting part about it. Is like, when you see it on external recorders, we see it on cameras, that's when we're going to start noticing who's winning the battle.
Right.
But it's not supposed to be a win the battle. It's how much better is it going to be for us as consumers, depending on what our workflow is.
Exactly.
That's an interesting point on that.
Yeah, and budget level too for storage and post-production. So.
And all of those affect everything. So,
exactly.
Are you going to bias towards the newer tools and offerings that Apple has with Final Cut, or are you going to go with the tried and true, color science and existing computational skills of Resolve as an industry leader? So it's an interesting. Let's go on to Premiere Pro. There was a lot of stuff that was announced in Premiere Pro, and it was kind of interesting because I think it's really cut down to four things. The addition of denoise and de-reverb in Audition. That's a huge. I pay for both of those plugins a lot. I've used de-reverb to take room tone out of things a bunch of times. It's one of the best plugins I use, and now to have it rolled into Audition, I think is a big deal. Mesh sculpting in After Effects. This again is for cartooning, for manipulation. We're going to see a lot in some of the other places. Also see it a lot in fake head shots. A lot of the AI for that is using that same kind of mesh sculpting technology.
Okay.
Color curves in Lumetri. Now Adobe's finally started adding curves in the Lumetri panel. Now, I don't know about you, if you work in Premiere for HDR, I still find it a little bit difficult personally. But Adobe's made some interesting bounds. But lastly, though, one thing I wanted to point out in here is that one of the coolest things that they put in here was actually the ability to graph spreadsheets in After Effects.
Yeah.
And you're like, what? And it's like, I see this as a really, really big aspect, particularly for motion graphics. I mean, being able to animate pie charts in real time, being able to do informational things for any kind of incoming service. But think about how this is going to be if you're adding spreadsheet data in AR. Real-time augmented reality input from a live spreadsheet, because the dynamic, how it was set would be dynamic if it's based on how Adobe works in every other spreadsheet document. The spreadsheets or documents then become dynamic fields for it. I mean, this is how Chiron works. This is how a number of people work based on an RSS feed. So that's kind of interesting. All right, let's get to the real fun meat of the matter. Matt, I'm going to throw it to you.
Yes,
let's
sir.
talk Laowa lenses.
Laowa, okay.
And let's just start this off.
Them.
Yeah, let's just start this off. If you pull up the first slide, Sean, I kind of broke these out simply in the Laowas because there's so many of the Laowa lenses on there. I really think it's important for everybody to understand that they group them different ways. So tell us a little bit about Laowa and what you're involved with.
Most people knew of Laowa from their photo lenses, and I'm not sure. I think you as well, Gary. We're not really sure how to pronounce it. I've always said Laowa. And I also am not entirely sure what the relation between Laowa and Venus Optics is. I think that Venus Optics is sort of their US name. But most people would know them from their photo lenses. They made really unique, different sort of specialty lenses. They had ultra wides, they had probe lenses, they had super macros, really cool stuff, not the normal, primes and zooms. And for the longest time, people have been modifying them, especially stuff like their 12 millimeter. I think even Arri had them modified for some of their rebadged stuff. And Laowa took notice, and they said, well, we could play that game, just like everyone else has in the past 5 years. Zeiss and Tokina and Sigma, everybody's sort of jumped on that train and said, well, we don't need people to modify them. We could do that ourselves. So they announced their dedicated cinema lens. Well, one of them is that 12 millimeter that I mentioned. It's just rehoused, made better for cinema. And then the other one is that zoom in that slide that you just showed. That is, as far as I know, that one, a dedicated from the ground up cinema zoom lens.
Right.
I can't say I understand the name, the I
was
don't know
thinking
how to.
about that too.
Yeah,
I
everybody
like
thinks
it.
it's a typo. Yeah, it's,
I did until I saw it printed on the side of the glass.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, everyone thinks it's a typo until you read it 2 or 3 times and you realize, well, no, that's intentional.
Right.
But you know, it's certainly not the worst name for a lens I've seen. We'll leave it at that.
No, there's lots of them, and they have such a wide variety, particularly in micro four thirds, the new DGA mounts,
Right.
You know, down to 8 millimeters and MFT. I mean, that's a 160 degree field of view on micro four thirds. That's pretty amazing. So
Yeah.
but yeah, but they broke it out interesting. They grouped them, and you know, like, and the slides that the information that they show on them is pretty interesting. I mean, most of them are 2.9.
Right.
They have variable close focusing points. Some of them focus as close as 6 inches.
Yeah, that's
Well, yeah, they have some of those crazy macros and the probe lenses that are really cool.
Well, yeah, they were known for probes. I mean, I've got a great shot of a Lauer probe wrapped with a copper tubing that's like flooding water through that a client did to keep it cool in a pizza oven. So it's like, I know about the Lauer stuff, but their optics are pretty amazing.
I know who that is. I know which client that is.
I actually, myself, I haven't shot with Laowa. I'm curious, you know, if either of you know, like not necessarily the specific price point, but are we talking about more of like the independent filmmaker would have an opportunity to use these lenses?
Oh yeah, Laowa's,
okay.
Everything that they make is done and it's designed and manufactured in China, and it has a Chinese price tag.
Right. Okay.
So
yeah. So I think that's really interesting, coming from more of like the independent market, having abilities to use lenses for all different types of formats.
Yeah. It's the cost of those things that we don't think about.
Right.
And that's why I wanted to include the Laowas, because if we're talking about really high priced lenses, we have to show that the cost effectiveness of a lot of the glass nowadays is being driven by the market.
Right.
And I mean, it was a short period of time a few years ago when we never considered lenses under $10,000 for cinema, ever.
I was thinking that this morning. There weren't even as many, obviously, that were even
there were very few,
applicable.
and they were all used and probably damaged at that price. So, but
Hey, Gary, just going to jump in real quick here. We got a comment from Christopher Lynch, who I assume is talking about the Lauer lenses, who says the 15 millimeter macro is indispensable. Super close focus. It's great. Not the sharpest, not the most expensive either. Great just to have in the kit. Which is kind of what you're talking about hitting that price point where independent filmmakers can have a good variety of lenses in their kit.
And that's the thing is that there needs to be glass for every price range.
Right.
And we've been biased. All of us, the three of us in particular, have been lucky enough to be biased on the very high end.
Right.
But we've also found that there's affordable lenses in all kinds of qualities.
Exactly. Yeah.
And since we're talking to the high end, let's just go right to lights. Let's go right to Leica because Light Cine announced last year, now all of a sudden they're making zooms and primes.
Right.
And completely redesigned from the ground up, which is something we haven't seen before by many manufacturers, to completely redesign a cinema line from the ground up.
Right.
Matt, you want to take a shot?
Sure. That's, I think most people saw that coming because Lights, formerly CW Sondra Optic, which was the sister company to Leica, the sister company that specialized in their cinema lenses. They just this year changed their name to Lights Cine Wetzlar. Anyways, it makes perfect sense. They've been poking around and trying to figure out what to do next. They really only had 2 lines of lenses, the Summoluxes, which came first, and the Summacrons. And they added a couple focal lengths to those, but other than that, they didn't really have a new product. So as far as I could tell, they've spent the past couple of years poking around the rental houses and high-end DPs saying, what do you guys want? What do you need? And I think one of the most common things that they heard was, we need a zoom to match your primes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, it should be full frame, which is just the way everything's going. So that makes perfect sense. And then I'm sure that the other biggest feedback they got was, we love the Summoluxes, we love the Summacrons, but everything's going full frame, so we need something with that red dot on it that will cover full frame. So all of this, the writing was on the wall. None of this is surprising at all. The only part that I think is surprising to some people is, like you said, Gary, that price tag. This will, basically that set of primes is, I think somebody had mentioned at one point about $500,000 for that set of primes. So they're definitely a rental house item.
Right. Well, but it also, I thought one of the interesting things about the zooms was they were truly telecentric.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
and
I think you're thinking of parfocal.
parfocal. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, telecentric. Well, I mean, it could be both, actually. I don't know.
I thought
But
it was both. Yeah.
It could very well be. The lenses being parfocal is sort of expected. I don't think that that's a selling point. That's an expectation for me.
Right.
And as far as them being telecentric, that'd be nice, but it doesn't really matter unless you're, really trying to get every ounce of performance out of those corner pixels.
Yeah, I would say maybe for the full format, that would be something those DPs would be looking for. So, yeah.
Well, and the thing is, I've always laughed at too, because we talk about full frame here, but Leica's always been a full frame company.
Right.
They never really designed glass. Wetzlar
That
never really designed glass for Super 35 based on the optics they were designing for the M series and R series cameras.
Right.
Because that was always full frame. So it was not. This is a great
Something
leap
new
for
them.
them
Yeah.
as a manufacturer. But it's an interesting way that we now have to discuss it that way because of Super 35 versus full frame.
Right.
And this brings up the whole other thing. People forget about the nature of full frame. Matt and I, we've had discussions together, and it's like people forget that why they like full frame lenses is they're usually a little bit longer, and it gives them that little bit extra telephoto, because that little longer lens that they have to use to cover full frame, if they're, in Hasselblad days, you'd be an 80 instead of a 50 for a 6x6 image.
Right.
You don't think about that, but that little extra telephoto effect actually enhances the bokeh of the image. And it's one of those things that people don't think about when they're thinking about optics.
Yeah, I would say definitely, especially for coming from cinema. I'm more from cinema than from stills. You two have more of a background in stills than I do, but from a cinema background, I think it's really interesting thinking about now with full frame, we can shoot the wider field of views and have that telephoto look to it, instead of traditionally in Super 35, the wider ones don't. So it adds more creative freedom into what we're looking for, and that narrowed up the field for cinema.
Which is what everybody sees nowadays.
Right.
It's like you see more and more of it, and as lenses get faster and faster, you see a much more creative use of depth of field in those environments.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the old days when we used to reverse all the swings and tilts on a view camera
Right.
to get that ultra minimalist depth of field. So.
Yeah.
Next on my list is the Sigmas. Sigma announced 3 new lenses in their lineup, 1.5 full frames. That brings their whole lens set to, no, we're a couple of lenses out. That's the Leicas. That's the Laowas. Go the other way. Keep going. There's the Leicas.
There's the
Next
zooms.
one. There we go.
There you
Sigmas.
Perfect.
I wonder where I got that from. So,
So now this fills out their set to, is it 10 or 12 that they have now in the
Is it
the
10
primes?
lenses?
10 lenses in the set, yeah.
Yeah, so it's really nice
For
that
the
now you have
primes.
the variety for the primes, right, for the full frame.
Well, and everything from a 14 millimeter to
I think it's 135.
135.
135,
Yeah, 135.
which is quite a selection of lenses for any cinematographer.
Right, yeah.
And they're
Yeah,
affordable.
this.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Matt.
the 105 was no surprise to anyone, because that was their. They had a still lens already on the market, so that one was expected at the very least. And the 28 and the 40, those are icing on the cake. Those just again, it goes to show that Sigma's listening, because they had their initial set of 7 lenses, and they did their homework and said, "What else do you guys want?" And they just poked around the cinema world. And that's what they came up with, a 28 and a 40. And I think most people would agree that they nailed it with those. The only focal length that I could see that people would want that they're missing would be like a 65 or maybe an 18. But I think this is a perfect addition to that set, and it's pretty well-rounded now.
Well, yeah, I would like something a little longer, maybe in the 150 range, just because I like that way that looks.
Right.
But again, there's not a lot of manufacturers that are pushing out lenses beyond 135, 120 millimeters.
Right.
So it's that.
Which would be nice if they could. That would be really nice then.
Right, because it would be that other aspect of it, and it'll be nice to see when they start doing things. One of the other things about Sigma shows a definite change in the philosophy towards lens mounts.
Right.
Because they're announcing LPL, the lens mount for Arri LF.
Right.
it's a 44 millimeter flange depth. It's a totally different way to look, and that the fact that Sigma's now doing this on a very inexpensive line says a lot about where they think LPL as a lens format's going to go.
Right.
I mean, Arri started with PL 100 years ago, or actually 87 or something like that was the first PL mounts.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting side too. And how many other manufacturers are actually going to start making LPL mounts for things?
Right. Yeah, that'll be interesting to see.
Matt, do you have any idea on that? I mean, because it's interesting.
Yeah, so it's an open standard for Arri. Basically, if you're a service partner, you can license it. I don't think there's any cost. So Arri obviously has the mount. Zeiss has already taken on the LPL with their Supreme primes. Sigma's doing it. There's a couple other manufacturers that are adopting it as well, but nothing. That said, Arri is the only one that has designed lenses specifically for the LPL mount, meaning the lenses have a shallow flange depth.
Right.
Then they can really utilize that flange depth. Everything else that is going to be every other manufacturer is going to be offering LPL mount is just adapting their existing glass, which is commendable, but it's not special at all.
That brings up an interesting point. Why would it have to be special?
There are benefits to the LPL mount if you use it as a dedicated mount. So, for example, the signature primes that Arri makes, they're utilizing that shallow flange depth, and they design their lenses
to meet that
specifically for that. So when you can keep your glass that close to your sensor, you're going to increase your light transmission. You can make your angle of incidence much less challenging. There's a lot of benefits to having that shallow flange depth. But everything else up till now, other than the signature primes, it's no different than using a PL to Sony E-mount adapter.
Right.
It's just filling the gap between PL and LPL.
Right.
Well, but if other manufacturers are coming to that, it shows a movement towards that environment.
Right.
On that same thing, I want to talk about an announcement yesterday about the L-mount alliance between Leica, Panasonic, and Sigma for still cameras, mirrorless cameras for cinema and still. It's another lens alignment. You've got the Canon, Sony battlefront on one side with their native mounts and native mirrorless mounts.
Right.
And now you see Leica, Panasonic, and Sigma joining forces to do their own mount for mirrorless cameras. And that's an interesting sidebar, because that's something that's going to affect both markets, I think.
Right, the lens and the mirrorless market, Yeah, I find it interesting too, seeing that now that would open up doors to not necessarily going straight towards a certain manufacturer type of lens based on the camera that you have, or not having to use an adapter all the time if you don't want to.
Well, and Matt, you use a mirrorless camera. I have a mirrorless camera.
Yeah, I have a mirrorless
camera.
Yeah.
And you look at you look at the offerings from Canon, from the new X-T3 from Fujinon. You look at the new ones from the R from Canon. Nikon's offerings, and now everybody's doing this. It's going to be really interesting to see where this goes.
Yeah.
Now that we've moved the viewfinder out of the way and we're not thinking about that as part of the process anymore.
Right. One of the things I think is so interesting about mirrorless cameras is the spectrum of how they are used. So they, still photographers use them, independent filmmakers, documentary filmmakers. On the super high end, people use them as well. So the idea that we can have any type of lens, that we're looking for the specific look, and then have the smaller mirrorless camera in a rig somewhere, to add as an additional camera is really interesting too.
I kind of take it as a flashback to the early Leica days.
Right.
These are rangefinders.
Yeah.
There's no SLR in there. You're shooting, and mirrorless is that same function. It gives you a different kind of feel, a different kind of look when you're shooting.
Right. That's true.
And as somebody who did my early days as a street photographer, following Elliot Erwitt and Friedlander and those kind of guys, in the way they shot stills.
Right.
Where you're doing grab and go on the internet. You grab and go on the street. Doing that kind of thing, it was a different kind of way to shoot, because you were usually only doing the focusing for framing and dealing with the rest of it all manually.
Right.
So it's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, really interesting.
As a still photographer, Matt, what do you think?
I'd consider myself a hobbyist at best. But I think it's really exciting because it's a clear sign that those three manufacturers are standing up to the big three: Canon, Nikon, Sony.
Yeah.
And the fact, I mean, the name says it all. It's the L Alliance. It's sort of them taking on the big guys, and I'm really excited. I think it's a great partnership. I was watching part of the presentation yesterday, and I think it was Panasonic that was speaking, because Panasonic is the one that's actually making the camera. It's a Panasonic branded camera using an existing Leica mount, and they acknowledged Leica for pioneering the mount, and they're touting this new camera and it's great technology, this and that. And it's a Sigma Foveon sensor. And the part that really struck me was it didn't acknowledge Leica as their partner for making glass. That nod went to Sigma. So traditionally, Leica is the powerhouse for manufacturing phenomenal lenses, and they still are. There's no question about that. But the fact that the Panasonic, I don't know if it was the president or product manager or somebody, the fact that he nodded to Sigma and was touting the fact that they'll have Sigma glass in this system, I think was pretty cool. I use a variety of still cameras, almost all of them mirrorless. And the Foveon sensor is unique, I guess you could say. I don't know if you've ever shot with a Foveon.
I have. I've shot with early generations of them, yeah. So.
Okay, early generations are even more, we'll say, unique.
Yeah.
Characteristic. But the fact that Panasonic, the fact that Panasonic and Leica are also in this alliance, that's what really gets me excited, because those two companies wouldn't jump on board if this product wasn't going to be good for the entire group.
Right.
So I'm pretty excited about that entire thing. And Megan's absolutely right. It's really going to bode well for photographers, cinematographers, that entire hybrid bridge that everybody's sort of trying to figure out how to cross or how to stay on somehow. I really do think it's going to be beneficial for everybody.
Well, and you look at it and it's like, there's Nikon, Canon, now lights are all come out with mirrorless cameras for this show. It's like, okay, new XT3, same thing, mirrorless cameras. So we think that's a way it's going to go. So as we start getting to the very end of this, I don't want to leave without covering anamorphics.
Yes.
Because that's a changing aspect of all of this.
Yes.
From the DSLR Magic add-on anamorphic with secondary focusing that's on the Fujinon MK lenses, which I saw a couple of weeks ago, and I think it is a fascinating way to add anamorphics to an existing set.
Exactly.
Through the new Atlas anamorphics that are coming out, and then Cooke announcing just before the show full frame anamorphics, full frame plus anamorphics.
Yeah.
I think that's a whole different aspect to all of this.
Right.
From a shooter side.
Yeah.
Talk about anamorphics. I know you like them.
I do. Big surprise.
Yeah.
Actually, you know what I was thinking about this morning too, looking at all the updates, is what it really inspires me to do is test more and more, because also the squeeze factor is different now on the anamorphic lenses. So, where I had all that memorized before, now there's different squeeze factors with different manufacturers based on the sensors that they're designed for. So even in the cameras now, we have multiple different formats and aspect ratios we can shoot. So it's really inspiring to me, because now you have all these different options on all different levels of budgets.
Right.
For we've got the high-end beautiful Cooke lenses. We have the adapters that we can add to the Fuji E-mount lenses, for example. So again, just adding a variety of styles so you can really pick the look for your project. But like I said, it does inspire me or convince me to test more as well, instead of just assuming, going with what you've used before, because there's just so many options out there.
Well, and we get into the, the 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, 1.9, 2.0.
Yes.
I mean, there's a 2.2, I think, anamorphic.
Right.
It was like, how in the world can we figure? I mean, I understand that a 1.2 anamorphic on a 16:9 gives me a 2:1. All right.
Right.
That's simple.
Yeah.
And on a conventional square image, a 2 anamorphic gives me a 2:1 aspect ratio.
Right.
Now, for those of you that don't know what anamorphics were about, anamorphics were developed to get the most out of a 4:3 frame of film.
Right.
You got all the individual, threads of emulsion that were possible by shooting a square to be able to do widescreen. That's what it was developed for, you know.
Exactly.
But this brings up a whole new level of shooting, and it's like people don't understand that you know, old school optics, I'm used to them being soft on the edges.
Right, exactly.
New people like, no, it's soft on the edges. No, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And then you get, you know.
Hey Gary, we've got a quick question
Fire
here.
it in.
While
Yes,
we're talking
please,
about anamorphics from Ryan O'Hara, who's asking if Hawk has full frame anamorphics too. Does anybody know?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a very good question.
It's my understanding that the Hawk anamorphics are all for Super 35.
Right.
They might cover some of the secondary images that are available, you know, because of the way the older vintage Hawks might have a little bit bigger than a circle. The 1.2s might have a little bit bigger image circle, but I think all of that was designed for Super 35. It might cover a little bit bigger depending on which focal lengths.
Right.
That's when
question.
it gets complicated.
Yeah.
The Hawk, I want to say there was Hawk 65.
Well, that would cover it. Yeah, that would cover it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would cover.
But I don't know that those are readily available.
Yeah, well, that brings up the other flip side of it. You know,
right.
it's like, oh, there's only 6 or 7 sets of them in the world.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things about anamorphics. As we start seeing more and more use for anamorphics, you know, we started with really clean digital images, then we went to soft edges, and we wanted the characteristics of glass. We got away from it. Now we're going back to the characteristics of a true optics, where, you know, soften the edges and do those kind of things.
Right.
So it's interesting to see how people are moving through the discussion.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about from your point, Matt, when it comes to you know, how do you handle the anamorphic side of things and questions for on anamorphics?
Well, you kind of nailed it when you said that the original purpose for anamorphics was to gain a wider field of view.
Yeah.
When you had a specific film size and the technology that we had back when anamorphic was introduced, there was a very limited selection of wide-angle lenses, which we don't really have a problem of anymore. Even on full frame, you can get 14 millimeters. You can go to 12 millimeters, which is absurdly wide. There is no shortage of ultra wide lenses anymore. It's not challenged to get a crazy wide field of view, even on full frame these days. And then Super 35, even more so. I mean, you've got something like the Arri 8R that's crazy wide with very little distortion.
Right.
And a zoom of that focal length.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So the
ultra-wide.
whole purpose of anamorphic being to achieve a wider field of view, that concept is out the window. Nobody's shooting anamorphic, as far as I know, to get a wider field of view. These days, you're shooting anamorphic because you want a look.
Right.
Everybody wants that, like you said, the softness in the corners. They want the flares. They want the characteristics of that anamorphic. I might be completely wrong here because I'm not a cinematographer. I don't claim to be a cinematographer, but I can't imagine there's anyone that is shooting anamorphic because they're trying to get wider than what is available shooting
I would
normal.
agree with that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
It's always about the look.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see, you know,
and
the reason it was invented versus how it was, you know, has been adapted,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and I think that's where certain companies are really moving ahead quicker than others. So, for example, Atlas.
Yeah.
Atlas introduced their Orion series?
Correct.
Like 2 years ago, I think. And they're just now starting to ship out, and they, from a technical standpoint, they are not great. But that's brilliant because it's exactly the image that everyone wants.
Right, smart.
I don't know if you've seen stuff shot with them, but they are at the moment, as far as I can see, they're probably some of the nicest looking anamorphics you can get, and they're affordable too.
Yeah, amazing.
Now Cooke moving forward with their full frame stuff, that's just, I mean, again, writing on the wall. I hate to sound like a broken record, but if anybody had the capacity and the technology to make consistent large format anamorphics, it would be Cooke.
Right.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Well, and that's the great part about the time we live in now. We've got this ability with, Atlas being able to produce low-cost anamorphics, add-on anamorphics for the Fujinon MK series and other lenses.
Yeah.
And then you have Cooke and Ari and other Hawk making full-blown glass for the kind of sensors that, the high-end people need. So there's a little bit of anything and everything, and it kind of reflects our society right now. We're in an environment where we've got tools for every level of cinematography.
Right. And aspect ratios. That's the thing I was thinking about.
Oh, we're back to that
There's
again.
so many different aspect ratios we can do.
Red started this. Now we have to go back to that. We can have 6,000 different formats.
But it does change the look and the feel. So,
Well,
going back to there's a technical side and then there's, well, what's the reason?
It could be Wes Anderson. We just changed the front cropping for every different period we're in just to make the thing look right. So, all right. So closing out, anything from IBC that you really want to talk about that we didn't cover, Matt? Anything you heard?
No, you touched on most of them. I think the Laowa stuff is exciting. That's interesting to see where they go. I did a post on that when I heard about it, and I'm going to be very interested to know if they go the typical Chinese route and sort of, say, oh, it's good enough, or are they going to really step up and become a quality manufacturer? So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But you guys, you touched on pretty much everything else that's relevant.
Megan?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think we touched on most things that are covered. Looking forward to seeing them as well and testing them. So
yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So Rachel, are there any other questions?
We just got one little last comment on the anamorphic discussion here from Ryan, who says the idea of anamorphics was originally about saving resolution when shooting for wide aspect ratio formats, not necessarily wide FOV, but the idea is the same. Nobody today is shooting anamorphic for the resolution savings. It's for the look only.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. Good point.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan.
And then just one last thing from Christopher, who says, do we have any idea what the cost of the Laowa is? We might have covered that earlier, but we know it's a little on the cheaper side.
I didn't see pricing on any of the Laowa stuff yet. Matt?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no official pricing. I don't think I can release it, so I'm not going to say
what it
is. But it's like I said before, it's in line with Laowa products, so it's very affordable.
Right.
So with the standard now being sub $5,000 for low cost lenses, I think that kind of gives you a pretty good marker for it.
I mean, if you look at
for prime lenses,
right? For prime lenses,
it's a 25 to 100, I believe. So you're comparing it to something like the Zeiss 21 to 100 or the Cabrio 20 to 100.
Right, a really big range.
Or 20 to 120. So those are in the 10 to
15,
$13,000 range. So if you take that as a major manufacturer, then you look at the Laowa price, you're looking at probably half that price.
Right. Well, and that's the thing is I do it on still, and it's like a zoom lens is always 3 times the price of a still lens.
Yeah.
At least twice or 3 times is the good way to think about it. So 25, 50, 100. Oh, that's 3 times as much. Okay, I got 3 lenses
all
worth.
in one.
And it's a way. Well, I mean, anybody who doesn't think about the glass costing that much is not thinking about how the process works.
Yeah.
So it's roughly not quite 3 times the cost of a single lens is what the zooms go for.
Right.
Pretty much in every manufacturer.
Yeah.
It's like 2.5 times. So it's an interesting way to look at it. So
you just take the zoom ratio and multiply it by that. So 12 times zoom is going to be 12 times the price.
Right.
Well, I'm sure the manufacturers would like that. The rest of us wouldn't. So I want to thank you for that, Matt. In Chatsworth, Matt Duclos at Duclos Lenses here from AbelCine in Chicago. We've got Megan Donnelly. I'm Gary Adcock for Zacuto Live. We want to thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next week.